stick and then drops the stick and starts running away, I no longer have a privilege to use self-defense against him or her, because I'm no longer trying to prevent a tort. On the other hand, if he hits me with the stick and then raises the stick to hit me a second time, I certainly have a privilege to use force to protect myself. What force can I use? That's the second element, reasonable force. What does reasonable force mean? Reasonable force is the force that would appear necessary to the reasonable person. Well, I'm going to tell you a little trick about how to argue about that in a moment, but let's work on that appear necessary part. You know, I may use more force than actually is necessary. Suppose, for example, that you're coming at me and you're going to play a joke on me, and you have this very realistic-looking pistol that happens to be made out of licorice. And you're coming at me with the licorice pistol. Well, you know, I really don't have to use any force against you at all, because you can't hurt me with that pistol. But the pistol looks so real that I think you're going to kill me. So, I hit you with a baseball bat. Well, ordinarily, if I hit you with a baseball bat, I'm committing a battery against you, right? But in this case, if I was attempting to prevent a tort, and I was using the force that appeared necessary under the circumstances, I may have been privileged to do it. But remember, we say reasonable force is the force that appears necessary to the reasonable person. And some people are going to have a tendency to say, the question is whether the force was reasonable. Reasonable force is the force that would appear necessary to the reasonable person. This would have appeared necessary, and therefore it was reasonable. And that's what we call circular reasoning, and you want to avoid that. What you want to do is be able to actually make an argument about whether something was reasonable or not. And now I'm going to tell you the little trick for doing that. Whenever you act, no matter what act it is you're performing, the act that you're performing has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. If the disadvantages outweigh the advantages, the act is unreasonable. On the other hand, if the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, then the act is reasonable. And in this case, we're talking about how the advantages and disadvantages would have appeared to the ordinary person in my shoes. So, you're coming at me with a licorice pistol. The ordinary person in my shoes would have believed that his life was in danger because the pistol looked so realistic. I hit you with a baseball bat. The question is, did I use reasonable force? Now, what are the advantages of hitting you with a baseball bat? What are the disadvantages of hitting you with a baseball bat? Well, the disadvantages are that I could hurt you very, very badly. The advantages are that I saved my life, or I did what appeared to save my life. If the advantage of saving my life outweighs the disadvantage of hurting you very badly, then my act was reasonable and the force I used was reasonable. On the other hand, if saving my life is outweighed by the risk that I created to you, then my act was unreasonable and the force I used was unreasonable. So you're going to have to argue about it. When you argue about it, though, remember that the courts always respect a person's right to defend his own life. So even if I take your life to save mine, the chances are a court will find that I acted reasonably, because to me, and to the reasonable person in my shoes, my life is the most valuable thing in the world. On the other hand, if all you're doing is stealing my pen, you know, I have one of those valuable Mont Blanc pens, costs about 80 bucks, and you're stealing my pen, and in an attempt to prevent you from stealing it, I shoot you with a gun, the chances are my act was unreasonable. Why? Because the advantage of my act, I saved the $80 pen, is outweighed by the disadvantage of my act, which is that I took a human life. And the courts always take the position that nothing on earth is more valuable than a human life. And that's why deadly force is reasonable only when it's used in response to deadly force, or what appears to be deadly force. So if you're trying to hit me with a bag of marshmallows, it wouldn't be reasonable for me to shoot you with a gun, because I'm taking your life to protect myself against a minor blow, a minor insult. The disadvantages of my act of shooting you outweigh the advantages of protecting me against the minor insult. On the other hand, if you're trying to shoot me with a gun, it's probably reasonable for me to shoot you with a gun, because To the ordinary person in my shoes, my life is the most valuable thing on earth. And so, it's reasonable for me to take your life to save my own. So if you get around to reading that case of Katko against Briney, the case of the guy that had an empty house that had been burglarized so many times that he decided to prevent it from happening again, and he set up a spring gun so that when the thief broke into the house to try to steal something, the spring gun went off and shot him. Remember, that was an unoccupied house. You know, or you will know when you read the case, that the court held that the force that the owner of the house used was unreasonable. Why? Because he was just trying to protect things, the house and whatever the house contained. And in order to protect things, he was risking a human life. In fact, the person who got shot with the spring gun lost his legs, I think, or one of his legs. So he was risking life or limb for the purpose of protecting things, and they weren't even valuable things. The general rule is that deadly force is never reasonable unless it's being used to protect a human life. And in Katko against Briney, the only life that was at risk was the life of the thief. Now, we've been talking about three defenses, three affirmative defenses, defense of self, defense of others, defense of property, that involve an attempt to prevent a tort. There's another affirmative defense that we have to look at that is a privilege to use force after a tort has been committed. This one is called recapture of chattel. Recapture of chattel. Now, a chattel is an item of property that is not realty, an item of property that is not land or anything permanently attached to the land. And if somebody steals or takes my chattel, I may have a right for a short period of time to use force to get that chattel back. The law does not favor this affirmative defense because the law would prefer that we settle our disputes in court rather than by using force. But the law also recognizes my natural tendency to try to get my chattel back, and it gives me a privilege to use force in doing so. And the privilege is called recapture of chattel, or the affirmative defense is called recapture of chattel. And it's got three essential elements. First, wrongful dispossession. Second, prompt action. And third, reasonable force. Wrongful dispossession, that's the first element. I'm only allowed to use force to get a chattel back if the chattel was taken from my possession. That means I had it and somebody took it from me. And I'm only allowed to use force against the person who actually dispossessed me of it. So, suppose somebody steals my briefcase and he runs around the corner and I start chasing him like crazy. And when I chase him around the corner, I see someone who's holding a briefcase just like mine. It isn't my briefcase. The person I see looks just like the thief. In fact, it happens to be his identical twin. But he's not the guy that took my briefcase. He had nothing to do with the theft of my briefcase. And I push him and I snatch the briefcase out of his hand. So he sues me later on for battery and maybe some other torts. And I say, well, no, I was trying to recapture my chattel. Remember, no matter how reasonably I was acting, I had no right to use force against him because he's not the dispossessor. And so the privilege to recapture a chattel is not mine in that situation. The second element, prompt action. The privilege to use force to recapture a chattel operates only when I am acting immediately after the chattel was taken from my possession. Prompt action means that I started acting immediately and I didn't act long enough to have a chance to cool off, and there wasn't any substantial interruption. So if you steal my briefcase and I chase you around the corner, I might have a privilege to use force to get it back from you. But if I chase you for a day and a half, I've lost the privilege. By then, so much time has gone by that I should have cooled down and I should have resorted to the courts to get it back. And finally, reasonable force. Remember, what I'm doing now is trying to get my chattel back. So, deadly force isn't going to be reasonable. The chances are that serious physical force isn't going to be reasonable because all I'm trying to get back is a chattel. Well, how do I know it's not reasonable? Remember our argument? You look at the advantages and the disadvantages. I'm trying to get back a $200 briefcase. If I use a baseball bat on the fellow that took my briefcase, I'm risking his life or his safety.